Well, when the Parti Québécois started talking about a charter of values, to some it looked like a straight-up attempt to create a wedge issue. So what is a wedge issue, and when does it work? The insiders know all about that. They've all either used them or tried to block them. Kathleen Monk is with the NDP. Jamie Watt is with the Conservatives. He's in Edmonton tonight. Kathleen's in Ottawa. And David Hurley is here in Toronto. He's with the Liberals. I'm actually being surprised these last few days since we started talking about things as a wedge issue in Quebec, just how many people said, explain to me again, what is a wedge issue? So David, give us the 101 on wedge.
Peter, a wedge issue is when a political party, it generally happens to be a government that's probably starting to lose some of its traditional supporters, puts an issue or a policy on the table that is so polarizing that it trumps other political considerations voters might be making and galvanizes supporters around that core idea. And the wedge has to attract enough supporters that you can win with that group of people. And unlike other policy issues where generally the objective is to avoid controversy, in the case of a wedge issue, you actually want a large controversy. The fight is part of the strategy because you want voters at the end of the day to say, I stand with those people, not with those people.
Okay, you've kind of answered this in the definition, but Kathleen, when is the right time to go for it, to use a wedge issue?
Well, like David said, it's obviously you do it when you want to bring more voters over to your party, and you feel that the calculation or the risk involved, because all wedge issues do have a lot of risk involved, lots of reward, but also lots of risk. You use them when you want to make that clear differentiation between your party and another party to kind of accentuate the cleavages between the two. But I would say that not all wedge issues are cynical politics. They're not all negative. They can be used just to show contrast.
Yeah, because that is the perception, right? That they're negative when you use it.
Yeah, the perception certainly is that they're largely cynical political moves, that they're meant there to fan the flames of aggression or anger or intolerance. But that's not always the case. Parties often use wedge issues to show clear distinctions between their party and where their principal stands are and where the other party stands.
All right, Jamie, what's the most effective way to use a wedge issue?
Well, the most effective way to use a wedge issue is to make sure it doesn't blow up on you. It's a little bit like one of those chemistry sets, you play with in the garage. You've got to be careful that you know what you're actually doing. Because as both David and Kathleen have said, they're inherently controversial. The communications around them and the rollout around them have additional risks. So you want to make sure that you double down on the way you roll it out the door. You want to make sure you make a big splash when you announce it so that you get a head start on your opponents in terms of how it's framed and communicated. And crucially, you need some third-party endorsers. You need some other people to come along and say it's a good idea as well.
You're nodding your head on that, David?
Well, I think both Kathleen and Jamie have hit on something really important, which is that if people sense it as a cynical political strategy, it will absolutely backfire. So it has to have policy at the root of it, and it has to have a position that people believe to be legitimate at the root of it. If you're stripped naked as just trying to manipulate people, they'll resist that, which we may be seeing in the province of Quebec, even if they do agree with your side of the wedge.
Right, and a political party to that point can play a bit of jiu-jitsu. If it's not good public policy motivated by that, and if it actually is cynical politics, and like, as David says, the public sees through that, you actually give an opportunity to your opponent, your enemy, to actually make a more principled stand and actually take back the play, if you will.
But if you get it right, Peter, you also get a fundraising opportunity too, right? And that's something we don't talk about too much, but the truth of the matter is, if you get it right, you can actually attract a lot of money based on the wedge you take.
One of the biggest wedges in Canadian history is also one of the most important policies in Canadian history. That's free trade.
That's true. And there were, the clear definition between the two sides. But let me just, before we go into some other examples, let me just expand on that point a bit, because, I can see how it can work in a country with two parties, like you watch in the States. Here it's a little more complicated. You're dealing with at least three parties. Is it a different play? The way a wedge issue is used here in a multi-party situation. David?
Well, it makes it a lot more complicated because in the United States, if you drive people away from one party, they axiomatically come to your party, but that is not the case in Canada, as Jamie points out. regularly. So it makes it more complicated. So you have to choose a wedge that for one reason or another is uniquely ownable to you, that your side of that wedge is uniquely ownable to you. It doesn't do you any good to create a wedge between yourself and another party if the votes go to a third party altogether. So you need to find something that neither of the other two parties can own your piece of it.
And that's kind of what happened in free trade. Well, it's not kind of what happened, it is what happened.
It is what happened, yeah.
Right. Okay, let's talk examples here. Let's first of all talk ones that have worked. What's your best example of a wedge issue that's worked for the party that used it? Jamie, start us.
Well, I think it's one that's in the process of working right now, and it's Justin Trudeau's position on legalization of marijuana. Back to Kathleen's point that these don't necessarily have to be negative. They can be positive wedges. He's taken a position that the Prime Minister absolutely cannot take. He's driven contrast with the Prime Minister. He is new and modern and forward-looking. He's backed the Prime Minister into looking back to his base. And not only has he wedged himself effectively with the Prime Minister, he's probably stolen some votes from the New Democrats. And on top of all of it, he really hasn't done himself any harm. People who didn't like him before just have one more reason not to like him. So that's a wedge in progress, I would say.
Wait, when did you switch parties? I don't know. Did I miss something?
I just think he was pretty smart. Yeah, I think it's a smarter move than people have given him credit for.
Kathleen?
Well, I think one of the most successful wedges, certainly in politics, has been the gun registry fight. I think my colleagues will probably agree with me, both on the fundraising aspect, as Jamie pointed out, but also because it was really a wedge issue that's been used successfully by the Conservatives for 10 years. We like to refer to it as the political issue or a political wrecking ball, if you will, that literally just moved back and forth, harming both the Liberals and the NDP quite seriously in the number of years that the Conservative government used it. I mean, they campaigned it on 2006, but successfully actually didn't bring it to a vote till many years later. As a result, they got to continue to inflict damage on those parties. And one of the key strategies in using a wedge issue is you actually want to divide your opponent. You actually want so much internal confusion and conflict in your opponent's party that the leadership of your opponent or your enemy is so consumed by the issue that they actually can't move their issues up the field. So in this case, with the gun registry, for instance, I mean, I know the NDP was very much absorbed with that issue, as I'm sure the Liberals were as well, in terms of trying to mitigate the damage, to really control the crisis that the Conservatives were trying to inflict upon us.
David?
Well, Kathleen has picked such a fascinating example because she's exactly right about how effective a wedge that was for the Conservatives against the Liberals and to a certain extent the NDP in the latter years of its incarnation. But what makes it fascinating is that the gun registry was originally launched by the Liberals as a wedge against the Reform Party. And it was extremely successful for them as a wedge issue for a number of years until the worm turned on it. So in 1993, the Liberals find themselves with the Progressive Conservatives gone and the urban base and the Ontario base that they had gone along with it, and they're facing a significant number of people, all of them from Western Canada, many of them from rural Western Canada, and the Liberals picked this issue to demonstrate, to create a wall against the Manitoba-Ontario border, to say to urban voters, particularly in Ontario, those guys are not like you. We are like you. So you may agree with them on economics, or you may agree with them on a few other issues, but on this fundamental question, let me tell you, they don't think like you. They're from a different place. And that wedge worked for the Liberals until the cost of the program started to seem to suburban voters like it outweighed the effectiveness of the program. And the Liberals had knit suburban voters together with urban voters, and the Conservatives cracked off the suburban voters and united them with their rural voters and flipped the wedge back on the Liberals.
All right, what goes around comes around. I've only got a minute left, so you got to be each very quick on this. You warned us about wedge issues of backfire. Jamie, what's your best example of that?
Yeah, I think the best example of that is John Tory's funding for religious schools. It looked like a pretty smart idea at the time, I'm sure, to him and to his campaign team, but they didn't get the communications right. And there's an example of a risk that they took that was definitely not worth taking.
That and being, of course, in Ontario provincial politics. Kathleen, your example.
There are many examples examples, hot button examples over the years, normally to do with either same-sex marriage or abortion choice issues, that often can backfire if you don't have your caucus aligned. So, and it's affected all sorts of parties on that issue, the NDP, the Liberals, the Conservatives. If you put a wedge issue forth, vote on a motion for say, if you don't have your caucus behind you, it will splash back at you and will harm you. Part of the calculation is always, will it harm your enemy more than it hurts you, and are you willing to take that hit?
You have to be quick, David.
2006, we made a mistake. We were desperate. We were losing. We led off the second debate with a plea to get rid of the notwithstanding clause, trying to create a wedge over individual rights with Mr. Harper, and it was out of context. It didn't go anywhere, and we actually missed our opportunity for Mr. Martin to put his last best case to be Prime Minister forward.
Great discussion. You all were very frank on it. Thank you much, David. Here in Toronto, Kathleen in Ottawa, and Jamie this night in Edmonton. Good to have you all back. And we'll see the insiders again in 2 weeks.